The Curse of Lovelock Cave. I never believed in curses. I never believed in monsters, spirits, or legends either. But now, sitting in the quiet stillness of my home, I feel a shiver every time the wind howls or shadows shift on the walls. What happened in Lovelock Cave changed me. I don't care if people think I'm crazy. I know what I saw, and I know what haunts my dreams every night. It all began innocently enough, a research trip to uncover the truth behind the Paiute legend of the red-haired giants. These creatures, they said, once roamed the Great Basin, terrorizing the native tribes with their size and appetite for human flesh. When I read the story, it felt like just that, an exaggerated myth passed down through generations to scare children. But we were scientists, seekers of truth. We weren't chasing ghosts, we were after history, artifacts, facts, or so we thought. The team was small. Dr. Carter, an archaeologist with a passion for debunking myths; Lisa, a paleontologist obsessed with the history of the region; Ben, our equipment tech; and me, Jack, a graduate student, hungry to make a name for myself. Dr. Carter had heard rumors of strange remains in Lovelock Cave, so we packed up and headed out. It was remote, silent, as if even the desert air refused to venture too close to the cave. The locals were no help. They avoided the cave like the plague, muttering something about it being a place of death. We laughed it off. At the time, the idea of ancient giants seemed ridiculous. The cave itself was more imposing than I expected. Its entrance loomed before us, wide and dark, like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. Inside, it was cold, despite the desert heat outside. Our lights pierced the darkness, revealing stone walls marked with faded paintings and strange, deep scratches. Something was unsettling about the place, though none of us admitted it at first. There was a thickness to the air, a weight pressing down on our chests that made it hard to breathe. But Dr. Carter brushed it off as nerves. We set up camp just inside the cave's entrance, deciding to dig deeper the following day. That night was the first time I heard the whispers. It started faintly, like the wind passing through a narrow crevice, but there was no wind inside the cave. The others slept soundly, oblivious, but I lay awake, staring into the dark expanse of the cave. The whispers were unintelligible, like distant voices, but one thing was clear: they were angry. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the eerie atmosphere was getting to me, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence lurking in the shadows, observing, waiting. The next morning, I didn't mention it to the others. We had work to do, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. The first day of digging was uneventful, but strange things started to happen after that. Lisa found something, a bone fragment. At first, we were excited. It could have been from an ancient animal, or maybe even a human, but the more she examined it, the more disturbed she became. "It's too large," she muttered. "Too dense." Dr. Carter waved her off, though I could see doubt flickering in his eyes. We continued, unearthing more fragments, pieces of what seemed like impossibly large human remains. The deeper we dug, the more bizarre the findings became: enormous jawbones, teeth larger than any I'd ever seen. Dr. Carter grew pale but pressed on, his skepticism weakening with each discovery. Then we found the skull. I'll never forget that moment. Ben was the one who uncovered it, his face going white as he realized the size of what he'd found. The skull was massive, far larger than any human's. Its eye sockets were deep and hollow, staring at us with a silent, accusatory gaze. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt colder, heavier. We all felt it, an unspoken fear creeping into our bones. It wasn't just a skull. It was a warning. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. I could hear them, clearer now, angry, insistent. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, staring into the pitch-black cave. But it wasn't just the whispers. There were shadows moving in the darkness, shifting just beyond the reach of our lanterns. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. Suddenly, Lisa screamed. We all jumped up, rushing to her side. She was pale, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed toward the far end of the cave, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw something," she said. "Someone." We grabbed our flashlights, but there was nothing, just the empty darkness stretching out before us. Dr. Carter tried to calm her down, insisting it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But I knew. I knew, because I had seen it too, a shadow, tall and monstrous, moving in the distance. The next day, Ben found more bones, but by then none of us wanted to dig any deeper. We were all on edge, snapping at each other, plagued by the same creeping sense of dread. We should have left. We should have left. We should have packed up and run, but Dr. Carter was determined to finish what we started. He refused to let superstition get the better of him. "There's no such thing as curses," he said, more to convince himself than us. That night was the worst. The whispers were deafening, filling the cave with their hateful murmur. The shadows moved closer, circling us like predators. I could feel their eyes on me, feel their hatred. I didn't sleep. None of us did. We huddled together, clutching our flashlights, waiting for anything to happen. Then, just before dawn, they came. It started with a low rumble, like the earth itself groaning in pain. The ground beneath us trembled, and from the depths of the cave, I heard a voice, deep and guttural, like the growl of a beast. We scrambled to our feet, panicked, our flashlights flickering. And then we saw them. They were enormous, towering figures emerging from the darkness, their skin pale and stretched tight over impossibly large bones. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, filled with rage and hunger. These were no legends. They were real, and they were angry. Dr. Carter screamed, trying to run, but one of the giants was faster. It grabbed him with a massive hand, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I'll never forget the sound of his bones snapping, the way his body crumpled like paper. Lisa and Ben tried to flee, but there was no escape. The giants moved with unnatural speed, cutting them down before they even reached the cave entrance. I ran. I don't know how I made it out. My legs were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps shaking the ground, their voices roaring in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the desert, collapsing in the sand, gasping for air. I was the only one who survived. No one believed me, of course. The authorities said it was a cave-in, that the others were crushed by falling rocks. But I know the truth. The giants of Lovelock Cave are real. They're still there, waiting, watching, angry that we disturbed their rest. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see them. I hear their whispers, feel their eyes on me. They won't stop until they finish what they started. I know they're coming for me. It's only a matter of time. Location: Sierra Nevada, California. Year 2021. Jake turned onto a narrow dirt road that led deep into the heart of the Sierra Nevada National Forest. After a couple of hours on the road, they finally reached their destination, a secluded spot on the shore of a small lake with no one but them and thick trees stretching as far as the horizon. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jake said, looking out at the sparkling water that reflected the sunset. "Yes, it's beautiful here," Jane agreed, closing her eyes and enjoying the cool evening air. Emma, sitting in the back of the car with Tom, looked around nervously. She always felt uncomfortable away from civilization, especially in wild places like this. Tom, on the other hand, was calm. He was a confident, experienced traveler. "Come on, Emma," Tom said, seeing the look in her eyes. "It's just the woods. We've been camping many times before." "Something's wrong," she mumbled but didn't continue. Her words hung in the air. Setting up camp and cooking over a fire, they enjoyed the evening conversations, laughter, and sounds of the night forest. But amidst the familiar sounds of insects and the rustling of the wind, Emma kept listening for something new and strange. She thought she heard a muffled growl, like someone breathing heavily somewhere in the darkness. "You're too tense," Jake said, noticing her unease. "Relax. We're only here for a couple of days." She nodded, but the fear wouldn't go away. In the evening, they went to bed in their tents, unfolding their sleeping bags. Jake and Jane in one tent, Emma and Tom in the other. Night gradually covered the forest with a thick veil of darkness, and the fire they had lit went out, leaving only the faint glow of embers. Hours later, Jake was suddenly awakened by a strange noise outside. At first, he thought it was the wind or an animal running past, but the sound was repeated heavy footsteps and something that sounded like claws clawing at the trees. "Jane, did you hear that?" he whispered, but his girlfriend continued to sleep peacefully. Jake slipped quietly out of the tent, hoping to see what was going on. The darkness was impenetrable, and only the faint light of the lantern he'd brought with him cut through it. He looked round, and everything seemed calm. The trees stood still, the lake lay mirror-like. But suddenly he saw something flicker at the edge of the light, a huge, wool-covered creature with unnaturally long limbs. Its eyes, glittering in the lantern light, were red as fire. Jake froze. He didn't know if it was a wolf, a bear, or something else. His heart pounded frantically. The creature straightened up and let out a low, guttural roar that sent him to the bone. Without further thought, he rushed back into the tent, hoping it was just a play of his imagination. Morning greeted them with a quiet dawn. Jake told the others what he'd seen the night before, but they only laughed. "Are you sure you haven't been watching horror films?" Tom asked, humming. "There's nothing here but animals." Emma, though she didn't laugh, looked even more tense. She sensed that something was wrong, but she couldn't say exactly what it was. Tom suggested they go fishing at the lake to take their minds off things. Jake and Jane agreed, leaving Emma at the campsite. She refused to go with them, preferring to stay by the tent and do some reading. They left, leaving Emma alone. At first everything was quiet. She sat looking at the book, but her thoughts wandered. She heard that strange sound again, a roaring or moaning sound somewhere deep in the woods. Emma stood up, looked towards the dense trees, and felt an inexplicable fear overwhelm her. The forest looked different, as if it had begun to shrink around her like a trap on its own. An hour passed, then 2. The fishermen didn't return. Maybe they just got carried away, Emma said to herself. But an icy fear beat in her heart. By noon she could wait no longer. Taking her lantern and knife, she went in search of her friends, feeling everything inside her screaming that something had gone wrong. Emma followed the path leading to the lake, but where their boat should have been there was nothing. The lake lay quiet, dead before her. The water seemed too dark, as if something terrible lurked in its depths. "Jake? Tom? Jane?" she shouted, but there was only an echo and a faint wind. She walked deeper into the woods. The farther she went, the harder it was to breathe. The forest seemed to shrink, to grow denser and denser, and the silence was frightening. Suddenly she saw huge paw prints on the ground, leading deep into the forest. They were too big to belong to an ordinary animal. Her heart sank. Panic began to overwhelm her. She ran. The path led her further and further, and the further she went, the more she thought the forest was watching her. Rustlings in the bushes, faint sounds like breathing, followed on her heels. Suddenly she bumped into something the ground. It was Jake. His body lay unmoving, his eyes open, but there was no life in them. There were deep lacerations on his chest, as if the beast had torn him open with its claws. Emma screamed, but her voice dissolved into the silence of the forest. She rushed to run without looking back. Her feet slid on the ground, her heart pounding as if ready to jump out of her chest. Every rustle, every sound seemed to her to be the sound of pursuit. And there it was, the monster. A huge, bipedal creature with long claws, covered in dark fur. Its eyes burned with a red light, and its roar was thunderous. It stood in front of her, not allowing her to pass. Emma stopped, not knowing what to do. Her body was paralyzed with fear. This was something out of her worst nightmares, but it was happening in real life. She took a step back and the creature moved forward. Her legs began to shake and she realized she had no chance of escaping. But suddenly the forest began to whisper. Quiet voices, as if the forest had come alive, were calling for her. The voices grew louder, and Emma, not believing her ears, took a step to the side, darting into the dense thicket. The monster didn't follow her. Emma ran out to the lake. The water looked calm again, but now the place seemed cursed. She looked around, no boat, no friends, just her and the darkness of the forest that followed her. She didn't know how much time had passed when she saw the car. The jeep they had parked outside the camp. She ran to it, opening the door and throwing herself into the seat. She started the engine, turned the car around, and tore down the road away from this terrifying place. In the rearview mirror, she saw the forest behind them shrinking as if it wanted to swallow her, the monster or whatever it was left behind. John McCarthy was no stranger to camping. Every summer for 15 years, he had ventured into the wild forests of the Pacific Northwest, always returning with a story about how beautiful life in nature could be. He knew that the world could be lost behind the concrete walls of cities, but not in the woods. The forest was his refuge, a place where no one bothered him, where only the rustling of leaves and the whisper of the wind filled the air. This time, John chose a remote area of the Cascade Mountain Range, a spot that only attracted serious hikers. He prepared for a 3-day trek, packing food, a tent, a knife, and a GPS. It was a standard kit, essential for these woods. As he traveled, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time would be different. At first he brushed it off as pre-hike jitters, but as evening approached, the unease turned into something deeper. It felt as if the forest around him was alive, watching his every move. Night came quickly, as it often did in the wild. He set up his tent at the base of a hill, lit a campfire, and prepared a simple dinner from cans. The woods were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The birds had gone silent well before sunset, and the wind ceased to rustle the leaves, as if the forest was holding its breath. John sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, until sleep finally overcame him. But sleep brought no relief. He barely dozed off when something jolted him awake. The tent was intact, but the air felt different. A chilling dread crept over him. This wasn't just fear. Something was wrong. Then he heard the first sound, something heavy crashing through the underbrush in the distance. Footsteps. Large, thunderous steps, growing louder with each moment. John's heart raced, pounding against his ribs like a drum. A bear, he thought, trying to rationalize the noise. It made sense. The forests of Washington were full of bears. He reached for his flashlight, but the sound drew closer. It wasn't just loud, it was deliberate, as if something large and upright was making its way through the dense foliage. This was no bear. The sound stopped right outside his tent. Heavy breathing echoed in the stillness, only a few feet away. This breath was slow, ragged, as if whatever was out there was trying to acclimate to the air. Seconds stretched into eternity. John didn't dare to breathe, shrinking into himself, hoping that whatever was out there would move on, just like wild animals often do when faced with the unknown. But it didn't leave. Instead, John heard a tearing sound as something snagged on the fabric of the tent. It felt like a trap closing around him. Panic surged through him, and his fingers instinctively reached for his knife. But what could he do against whatever lurked outside? Fear paralyzed him, trapping him within the thin walls of the tent. Suddenly, a loud crack. Something slammed against the tent, causing it to collapse on him. In an instant, the material enveloped him like a shroud. John jerked, tearing at the fabric with his hands, scrambling to get free. It stood before him. A creature towering at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick black fur. Its eyes, gleaming in the firelight, were impossibly deep, as if they absorbed all the light around. Its hands long, ending in claws that could easily rip apart a tree. But the most terrifying part wasn't its appearance, it was the way it looked at him with purpose. Not just a beast. This was something with a mind of its own. John flinched as it moved toward him. With a shriek, he sprang to his feet and bolted, not caring where he was going. He needed to escape this creature. The forest became a maze with no exit. John ran, stumbling over tree roots, falling and scrambling back up until his legs began to fail him. And it was still chasing him. He could no longer hear the footsteps, but he knew it was close. Adrenaline waned, and panic turned into a primal fear. John stopped by an old tree, gasping for breath, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was it Bigfoot? He remembered tales he had heard since childhood about people disappearing in these woods. But now he didn't see them as legends. It was real. It was here. Something massive burst from the shadows, lunging at John with incredible speed. The creature struck him so hard that he fell to the ground, feeling the air rush from his lungs. Pain exploded in his chest as the creature pinned him down. John tried to fight back, but his strength was fading. Cold claws sank into his shoulders, and he felt blood trickle down his skin. "No," he whispered, gasping for air. The creature paused above him, its face hidden in shadow, but he could feel its hot breath. This was a true monster. But John refused to give in. With every ounce of strength left, he pulled out his knife and stabbed the creature in the side. It roared, stumbling back, giving him a moment to escape. John jumped to his feet and ran, screaming, his mind consumed with panic. The forest seemed endless, each step pounding with pain in his legs and lungs, but he couldn't stop. This creature was real, and it wanted him dead, and it was close. He ran all night, refusing to stop until he finally saw a light, a faint glow that meant a road ahead. With the last of his strength, John darted toward it, bursting out of the woods and collapsing on the pavement. Minutes later, a passing car found him. An elderly man pulled over, jumping out to help. "Good God, what happened to you?" he asked, alarmed at the sight of John, bloodied and shaking. John wanted to scream that it wasn't a bear, that it was something else, something worse. But all he could do was stare into the darkness. He felt the forest watching him even now, as if it were still there, waiting for him. The man opened his trunk and pulled out a first aid kit, rushing to John's side. "You were attacked by a bear?" he asked, worried. "No," John managed to say, his voice weak. "It's not a bear. It's something else. It hunts." The man frowned, confused. "Hunts? Listen, kid, you're in shock. It's easy to imagine things when you're out here alone. Right now, we need to get you to the hospital." But John knew it wasn't shock. It was fear, so real that it chilled him to the bone. That creature wasn't just a beast, it was a predator. The car roared to life, and John struggled to climb into the passenger seat. The road wound through dark hills, wrapping them in silence. Only the headlights and the sound of the engine reminded them they weren't trapped in that dreadful, lifeless void of the forest. "We'll be there soon," the man said. "Just hang on a bit longer." But John barely heard him. His mind was consumed by memories of that night, the shadowy figure, the sharp claws, the piercing gaze, and the suffocating darkness. His body trembled from the pain and the fear, not just physically, but emotionally. He could feel it lurking in the woods, waiting for him to let his guard down. Finally, they reached the town, small and quiet. The man parked outside the hospital, and medical staff rushed to John's side as he stumbled from the car, collapsing onto a stretcher. "Animal attack?" a doctor asked, examining him quickly. No, John tried to respond, but his voice was too faint. "It's not an animal. It's something else. You have to warn others." The doctors exchanged glances, but chose not to ask more questions. They chalked it up to shock, believing the injuries alone explained his state of mind. The wounds on his body were deep and strange, but their minds still clung to rational explanations. John lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The lights were bright and sterile, but even they couldn't chase away the darkness that seeped into his thoughts, dragging him back to the face of that creature. Days passed. The wounds on his body began to heal, but inside he felt broken. He silently listened to news about new tourists heading into the woods. Despite warning the police and forest services, his words were met with skepticism. Life continued as normal, and people ventured into the woods, believing that the worst they might encounter was a bear or a storm. No one believed in anything else. But John knew the truth. The forest held something dark, and it would return. It would slip from the shadows and find its next victim. And perhaps next time, no one would escape. The encounter in Arizona. I've always been a skeptic, a man who trusts only what can be seen and touched. I've spent many seasons hunting in the Arizona mountains, always returning with game. But that night changed everything. I chose this spot because it was remote. No one around for miles. Hunters rarely venture here, and among the ancient trees and steep cliffs, you could feel completely disconnected from the world. I was confident in my skills, my weapon was at hand, and I'd long grown accustomed to the dark and the sounds of the wilderness. But as night fell, something shifted. It started with small things. The forest, usually alive even in the night, suddenly went silent. Even the wind that played in the branches ceased. At that moment I didn't give it much thought, just added more wood to the fire and settled in, listening to the crackling logs. But soon it started gnawing at me. The silence became too loud, as if the earth itself held its breath. I tensed up. A faint crunch in the distance caught my attention. An animal? Maybe. I grabbed my rifle but decided it wasn't time to go out yet, too few signs of danger. But the longer I sat, the more I felt the overwhelming sensation that something was watching me. You know that feeling, when you're certain someone's eyes are on you, even though you can't see them. That's how I felt. Suddenly the fire hissed, as if a gust of wind had blown through, but the air was still. Just a cold shock, as if all the warmth had vanished. I stood up. Now the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't an animal cautiously approaching. No, it was something. Bigger. And this something was moving slowly, savoring each step, drawing closer to me. I stepped beyond the firelight, holding my rifle in front of me. The tension was palpable. My mind wrestled with the thought that this was all in my imagination, that I was just tired after a long day. But as soon as I took a step forward, the silence around me changed. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. It was footsteps. Footsteps that mirrored my movements. Every time I moved, something invisible followed. I stopped. And the footsteps stopped too. "Who's there?" My voice came out too soft, too uncertain to calm my nerves. No response. A minute passed. Maybe more. I couldn't tell. Time lost all meaning. I no longer felt safe. This forest was no longer just a place I hunted. It had become a trap. My heart began to race, and I decided to return to the fire. But the moment I turned back, something suddenly darted from the trees. It was too fast, almost like a flash. I raised my rifle and aimed at it. My hand trembled, and I smelled something familiar, a mixture of rot and iron. It stood there, a few meters away from me. A creature. Humanoid in shape, but its body was twisted, like that of a beast. Its eyes, black as night itself, stared right at me. I knew this wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something that shouldn't exist in this world. And it was alive. The creature froze, as if mocking me. It knew I was scared. Its face expressed nothing but silent hatred. Instinctively I fired, and the sound of the gunshot shattered the silence. The smoke cleared, and it was gone. But I knew I didn't miss. My heart pounded in my chest. Soon I heard that rustle again. It was still here. I felt it watching me from the darkness. I started backing towards the fire, trying not to betray my fear, but the sense that this creature could strike at any moment became almost unbearable. It was toying with me, playing with my nerves. At that moment, I realized it wasn't about fear. This creature wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to break me. It knew I was an outsider here. It was older, angrier, and far more cunning than I could have imagined. I made it back to the fire and began to noticeably lose control of myself. For the first time in my life, I felt fear take hold of me, as every cell in my body refused to fight, sinking into this maddening, suffocating terror. It became hard to breathe, as if the air itself in the forest had disappeared. I was suffocating. My mind screamed, begging me to find a way out, but the forest no longer felt familiar. Everything around had become alien, and each second I stayed here was killing me from the inside. The creature didn't appear again, but I could feel its presence. Every step, every sound was part of this game, and I couldn't tell if I was still in reality or in some grim nightmare. I knew one thing: this forest didn't want to let me go. I sat by the fire until dawn, not closing my eyes. And though I left that forest the next morning, I know I will never truly leave it. It haunts me every night, in every movement of the shadows outside my window. And every time I think I'm safe, I hear those footsteps. Footsteps of the one who knows what I saw. The one who will return. Night attack. They say the Arizona desert can mess with your mind. The heat, the isolation, the silence, it all plays tricks. But I'm not the type to be easily swayed. I've spent most of my life hunting, camping, and hiking in remote areas. I trust what I can see, what I can feel. I thought I knew these lands. I thought nothing could shake me. I was wrong. It was late September, and the temperature had begun to drop. The desert, while scorching during the day, turns bitter cold at night. I had set up camp near the base of a mountain ridge, an area I'd been to countless times before. It was quiet out here, just the way I liked it. No one around for miles, no distractions, just me, my tent, the stars, and the occasional rustle of desert wildlife. The fire crackled softly as I sat beside it, my rifle leaning against a rock. I wasn't worried about predators. The biggest thing out here were coyotes, and they usually kept their distance. I was the top of the food chain. That night, though, I wasn't. It started around midnight. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I was considering turning in for the night when I heard something in the brush. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The air was completely still. Then came the unmistakable sound of branches snapping under the weight of something heavy. Not a coyote. I reached for my rifle, my heart starting to thump in my chest, the sudden stillness making me hyper-aware of every tiny noise around me. My first thought was that maybe it was a mountain lion. I'd encountered them before, though rarely. They're elusive, careful predators that typically avoid humans. But this didn't feel right. The sound wasn't moving like a mountain lion. It wasn't stalking. It was closer. Deliberate. I stood up, slowly turning towards the source of the noise, my rifle at the ready. The fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows around the camp. The silence was now suffocating, as though the desert itself had held its breath, waiting. I scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for glowing eyes in the darkness. Nothing. Then, without warning, a branch snapped behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. For a split second, I saw it. Not a coyote, not a mountain lion, something else. The shape of a figure, hunched and low to the ground, darted out of the corner of my eye, vanishing behind the boulders. It moved too fast for me to make out what it was, but it was big, bigger than any animal I'd seen in these parts. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. My fingers tightened on the rifle. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firm, though there was a tremor in it I couldn't quite hide. No response. I stood there, listening, straining to hear anything beyond the rapid pounding of my pulse. And then it came the low, guttural growl. It was faint, almost distant, but unmistakably threatening. It sounded close, far too close. Suddenly, something barreled out of the darkness, too fast for me to react. It hit me like a freight train, knocking me flat on my back. The breath ripped from my lungs. My rifle was sent flying from my hands, useless now. I gasped for air, struggling to push whatever had hit me off, but the weight was crushing. In the flickering firelight, I caught a glimpse of it, this thing. It was crouched on top of me, pinning me down. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like appendages. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. And its eyes, they were black. Not like the eyes of an animal, but pits deep, empty voids that seemed to pull the heat from the air around us. I felt the sting before I saw the claws rake across my chest. Pain flared through me as it dug into my skin, tearing through my shirt like paper. I screamed, thrashing under its weight, my hands scrambling for anything to fight back. The thing growled again, a wet, guttural sound that made my stomach twist. It leaned in closer, its breath hot and rancid against my face. For a moment, I thought I was going to die, that it would drag me off into the desert, and no one would ever know what happened to me. My mind raced images of my family, my life, all flashing by in a blur. I wasn't ready to die out here. Not like this. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I shoved it off, managing to roll away. Pain shot through my side, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, searching frantically for my rifle. The creature hissed, enraged, and lunged at me again. But I dodged, grabbing a thick branch from the ground and swinging it with everything I had. The wood cracked against its skull, and for a second, it staggered, disoriented. I didn't waste time. I turned and bolted toward the fire. My heart pounded in my ears, and my chest burned from the cuts, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. It chased me. I could hear it, the soft patter of its clawed feet on the desert sand, always just a step behind me. The fire was dying, the last flames barely holding on. Desperation flooded me. I grabbed the closest log, thrusting it into the flames until it caught, then spun around, brandishing the burning wood like a torch. The creature stopped, snarling, its eyes narrowing at the flames. I could see its jagged teeth glinting in the dim light, hear its labored breathing. For a moment it seemed almost uncertain, afraid, even. "Get back," I shouted, waving the burning log in front of me. The thing hissed, retreating a step, then another. And then it was gone. It turned, disappearing into the darkness with a speed that left me breathless. I stood there, panting, the torch still raised, scanning the night for any sign of it. But there was nothing. Just silence. Deafening silence. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, feeding it more wood every time it threatened to die down, clutching my rifle close. My body ached, the cuts on my chest and arms stinging with every movement. But I was alive. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't care about the pain or the exhaustion. I just needed to get out of there. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, nearly 30 miles away, that I finally stopped. I checked into a cheap motel, locked the door behind me, and peeled off my shredded shirt. My chest was a mess of deep, angry gashes. I thought about going to the hospital, but what was I supposed to say? That some kind of monster attacked me in the desert? No one would believe me. Hell, I could hardly believe it myself. But the wounds were real, and every time I looked in the mirror, I could see them proof that something had been out there with me. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, late at night, I hear things outside my window, scratching, shuffling. I've moved twice since then, but it doesn't matter. No matter where I go, I hear it. And I know one night it'll come back, and next time I might not be so lucky.